The foundation of the collapse. History does not move smoothly from one era to the next. It advances through shocks, often violent ones, that only become obvious in hindsight. If you're sitting in a house in London, Melbourne, or Toronto today, staring at a utility bill that feels closer to a mortgage payment than a monthly expense, you're not witnessing a temporary market fluctuation. You're seeing the surface effects of a deeper structural change. We've been conditioned to believe that modern living is automatic, that electricity appears when we flip a switch, that warmth arrives when we turn a dial. But these aren't natural laws. They are the result of a very specific physical arrangement: cheap, abundant, high-density energy. That arrangement has existed in the West for roughly 150 years, and it is now being dismantled, not by resource scarcity and not by invasion, but by policy choices made far from the people who will bear their consequences. That arrangement is now being systematically, almost surgically, dismantled, not by an invading army, and not by a lack of raw resources, but by a suicide pact signed in the sterile boardrooms of Westminster, Ottawa, and Canberra. We are told this is a green revolution. We are told it's about saving the planet. But if you follow the money, and more importantly, if you follow the energy, a much darker picture emerges. It is the story of a deliberate, managed deindustrialization of the Western world. It is the story of how the very people sworn to protect our prosperity decided that the middle class was an energetic liability, a burden they could no longer afford to carry. Today, we perform an autopsy. We aren't going to talk about politics in the way the mainstream news does, which is just theater designed to keep the masses arguing over table scraps while the feast is carried away. We are going to talk about the master resource, because in today's world, energy is the only thing that matters. If you have cheap, abundant energy, you have a civilization. If you make energy expensive and scarce, you have a controlled collapse. This is the autopsy of that collapse. To understand why your life is getting more expensive, you have to understand what wealth actually is. Wealth isn't the numbers in your bank account. Those are just digital promises, easily broken by the thieves of inflation. Real wealth is the ability to transform the natural world into things that humans find useful. It's turning iron ore into a car. It's turning a field of wheat into bread. It's keeping a hospital at 22 degrees when it's -10 outside. Every single one of those actions requires work. And in the world of physics, work is the transfer of energy. This is why energy is the master resource. It is the base of the entire pyramid of human existence. If energy is cheap, everything else, food, housing, transport, healthcare, becomes cheap. If you intentionally drive up the cost of energy, you are intentionally driving up the cost of being alive. There is no way around this. You can print all the currency you want. You can offer all the government rebates you want, but you cannot print a kilowatt hour. You cannot subsidize a calorie into existence. For a century, the West understood this. We built the most prosperous civilizations in history because we mastered high-density energy, coal, oil, gas, and nuclear. We took the work that used to be done by human muscles and animal labor, and we handed it over to machines powered by ancient, concentrated sunlight. This created the middle class, a historical anomaly where an average person could live better than a medieval king. But that anomaly is being ended. The Suicide Pact is based on a lie. The idea that we can run a high-complexity industrial civilization on low-density, intermittent energy sources without a massive, permanent drop in our standard of living. The term net zero is a masterpiece of marketing. It sounds clean, it sounds balanced, it sounds like something a responsible person would want. But in practice, for countries like the UK, Australia, and Canada, net zero is a deindustrialization mandate. It is a commitment to destroy your own competitive advantage while your rivals, China, India, and the BRICS nations, are doing the exact opposite. While we blow up our coal plants and ban natural gas connections in new homes, China is building 2 new coal plants every single week. They aren't doing this because they hate the environment. They are doing it because they want to win. They know that cheap energy is the cheat code for industrial dominance. They are taking our discarded ideology and selling it back to us in the form of solar panels and wind turbines, while they use the master resource to build the world's future. In the West, we have traded engineering for activism. We have replaced the people who understand how a power grid works with people who understand how to write a sustainability report. And the result is exactly what you would expect: a system that is becoming increasingly expensive, increasingly fragile, and increasingly hostile to the very people it's supposed to serve. In the comment sections of our videos, we see the same sentiment over and over again. I feel like I'm being gaslit. And you are. You are being told that the rise in your cost of living is due to corporate greed or overseas wars. And while those play a role, they are secondary. The primary driver is the strategic sabotage of our energy infrastructure. When a government bans the exploration of its own gas reserves, as they have done in parts of Australia and Canada, they are making a choice to make you poorer. When a government shuts down perfectly functional nuclear plants, as Germany did, they are making a choice to destroy their industrial base. These aren't mistakes. A mistake is something you do once and correct. This is a decade-long, multi-billion-dollar policy. It is a design. The experts tell us that the transition will be seamless and cost-effective. But look at your bill. Look at the factory closures in the Midlands. Look at the energy poverty statistics in Europe. The experts aren't stupid. They just have different goals than you do. Their goal is compliance. Your goal is survival. This video is the bridge between those two worlds. We start with the nation that invented the modern world, only to become the first one to set it on fire. We are going to the United Kingdom, the laboratory for the Great Western deindustrialization. The execution of the British grid. On September 30th, 2024, at precisely 1 minute past midnight, the United Kingdom did something no major industrial power has ever done in the history of the modern world. It turned off its last coal-fired power station, Ratcliffe-on-Soar, a massive, iconic facility that had powered millions of homes and thousands of businesses for decades. Finally went dark. 142 years of British coal power ended not with a whimper, but with a celebratory press release from the Department of Energy. They called it a green milestone. They called it leading the world. They called it the future. But in the real world, the world of engineering, manufacturing, and national security, it was a suicide note. The United Kingdom was the first nation to industrialize. It built the greatest empire the world has ever seen on a foundation of cheap, reliable, domestic energy. It was the energy in the coal that forged the steel, powered the looms, and launched the ships. By killing its coal industry before it had a viable, cost-effective, and weather-independent replacement, the UK didn't save the planet. It simply signed away its own survival. Britain now relies on a fragile, expensive network of subsea cables to import electricity from France's nuclear plants and Norway's hydroelectric dams. They have traded energy independence for energy dependency. But here is the part they don't tell you in the high-budget BBC documentaries. When you stop producing your own energy, you stop controlling your own destiny. The UK now has the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world. Let that sink in. How does a British factory compete with a factory in Texas, China, or Vietnam, when its primary input costs are 3 or 4 times higher? The answer is simple. It doesn't. It dies. Or it moves. Look at the rubble of the Ferry Bridge C cooling towers. In 2021, they were blown up in a carefully choreographed PR stunt to show the world how serious Britain was about its net zero targets. But Ferry Bridge didn't just produce electricity. It was an integral part of a complex industrial ecosystem. The plant produced fly ash, a specific byproduct needed to create the cinder blocks that build British homes, hospitals, and schools. By blowing up the plant, the UK didn't stop needing cinder blocks. It just forced itself to import them from abroad at vastly higher prices. Every brick, every beam, every watt of energy now carries a middleman tax paid to a foreign power. This is the definition of deindustrialization. It is a massive transfer of wealth from the British taxpayer to foreign entities, all disguised as a moral crusade. By the beginning of 2025, the results were undeniable. Domestic energy debt in the UK hit a record high of over £4 billion. Entire industries, from steel to glassmaking, are facing an existential challenge. The British steel sector, for example, paid almost 1.8 billion pounds in extra energy costs during the gas crisis, even as its output fell by 40%. Think about the math of that. You are paying twice as much for half the product. That isn't a transition, it's an execution. Why would a government do this? Why would they deliberately hollow out their own economy and make life harder for their own citizens? To understand the suicide pact, you have to understand who is making the decisions. The West is currently ruled by a gerontocracy, a class of leaders who came of age during the peak of the fossil fuel boom. These are people who built their wealth when energy was cheap, when taxes were lower, and when the industrial base was still intact. They now sit on indexed pensions, government-funded healthcare, and massive property portfolios. To a 70-year-old politician in Westminster or a bureaucrat in Brussels, a 300% increase in the price of home heating is a statistical anomaly to be managed with a subsidy. They don't feel the bite. Their homes are paid for, and their heating bills are often subsidized by the very taxpayers they are impoverishing. But for the 35-year-old father in the Midlands, or the young entrepreneur trying to start a manufacturing business, it is an economic death sentence. We are seeing a massive, unacknowledged intergenerational theft by pushing for net zero at any cost and ignoring the laws of physics. The ruling class is essentially burning the ladder they used to climb to prosperity. They are telling the younger generation that they must accept a lower standard of living, smaller homes, restricted travel, and higher costs, all while the elites continue to fly private to climate summits in Dubai and Davos. In our comment sections, we see the reality that the politicians ignore. We hear from viewers in the UK who talk about the heat or eat dilemma. We read stories of pensioners sitting in public libraries all day just to stay warm because they are terrified of the smart meter clicking away in their hallway. This is the United Kingdom in 2025, a country that once conquered the globe, now unable or unwilling to keep its own citizens warm in their own homes. But as tragic as the British story is, the UK is just the first domino. The suicide pact is global, and nowhere is the irony more bitter and the betrayal of the public more profound than in the Southern Hemisphere. We are going to a country that sits on top of enough energy to power the entire world for 1,000 years. A country that should be the wealthiest and most secure on the planet, yet is now telling its citizens to prepare for a future of blackouts and managed decline. We are going to Australia, and what we found there isn't just a mistake, it's a crime against the future. The Australian paradox. If you look at a map of global energy reserves, Australia should be the wealthiest, most secure, and most industrially competitive nation on the face of the earth. It is a continent-sized quarry. It is the world's leading exporter of liquefied natural gas, or LNG. It is one of the top 3 exporters of coal. It has enough uranium to power the entire planet for centuries. On paper, Australians should have the cheapest electricity and the most robust manufacturing sector in the Southern Hemisphere. But reality, as we are discovering in this autopsy, has been sidelined by ideology. In 2025, a strange and dark irony has taken hold of the Australian economy. While massive tankers leave ports in Queensland and Western Australia every single day, loaded with energy to power the factories of China, Japan, and South Korea, the Australian domestic market is starving. The very people living on top of the world's energy treasury are being told to prepare for blackouts, to curb their usage during peak hours, and to watch as their industrial base, the smelters, the refineries, and the chemical plants, simply evaporates. The pattern suggests it ain't a lack of resources, but a lack of will. It is the second pillar of the global suicide pact. Nowhere is this insanity more visible than in the state of Victoria, in a move that shocked even the most cynical economic observers. The Victorian government essentially declared war on natural gas beginning in 2024. New homes and residential subdivisions were effectively banned from connecting to the gas network. They are being forced into all-electric mandates. Think about the physical absurdity of this. Natural gas is the most efficient, cost-effective way to heat a home and cook food. It is a resource Australia has in such abundance that it literally gives it away to the rest of the world. Yet, the Victorian government has decided that its citizens must instead rely on an increasingly fragile and expensive electricity grid, a grid that is being stripped of its reliable baseload coal power and replaced with weather-dependent renewables that simply cannot handle the surge of 1 million new electric heat pumps. One of our Australian commenters put it perfectly. We are exporting the cure and keeping the poison for ourselves. By banning gas, the government isn't lowering emissions in any meaningful way. It is simply driving up the cost of living for the average family while simultaneously making the power grid more likely to fail. It is a policy designed in a boardroom, ignored by the laws of physics, and paid for by the middle class. But why is domestic gas so expensive in Australia while the country exports so much of it? The answer is a betrayal of the national interest that borders on the criminal. For years, successive Australian governments allowed massive multinational energy companies to extract gas without a strict domestic reservation policy on the East Coast. In Western Australia, they were smart. They reserved 15% of the gas for the local people. Consequently, gas in Perth is relatively cheap, but in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, there was no such protection. The result? Australian manufacturers are often forced to pay world market prices for gas that was extracted from their own backyard. In some cases, it has been cheaper for Japan to buy Australian gas, ship it thousands of miles, and use it in their factories than it is for an Australian factory to buy that same gas locally. This is economic sabotage by omission. By failing to protect the domestic market, the Australian leadership has effectively subsidized the industrial success of its competitors while taxing its own people into insolvency. We are already seeing the results of this suicide pact. Look at the aluminum smelters. Look at the brickworks and the glass manufacturers. These are energy-intensive industries. They cannot run on intermittent power. When the sun goes down and the wind stops blowing, a smelter cannot just turn off. If the power fails for more than a few hours, the molten metal solidifies. The equipment is destroyed, and hundreds of millions of dollars in capital are vaporized. As electricity prices in Australia become some of the highest in the world, these companies are doing the only logical thing. They are leaving. They are moving to places where energy is treated as a strategic asset, not a political liability. And when they leave, they take the high-paying, blue-collar jobs with them. They leave behind a service economy of baristas and real estate agents, presiding over a country that can no longer build the things it needs to survive. And then there is the impact on the Australian heartland. To build the green utopia the elites demand, thousands of miles of new high-voltage transmission lines must be cut across prime agricultural land. We see the comments from Australian farmers who are being told their land will be seized for the greater good, while the very energy produced by those lines will be too expensive for them to use. This is the pattern of the suicide pact. It is the centralization of power at the expense of the producer. It is a system that punishes the farmer, the manufacturer, and the homeowner, all to satisfy a set of ideological targets that the rest of the world is already beginning to abandon. The Australian people are being told they are leading the way. But as any hiker knows, if you lead the way off a cliff, being first isn't a victory. But if you think the situation in Australia is dire, wait until we look north. Because in Canada, the suicide pact has taken a different, even more bureaucratic turn. A country with the second largest oil reserves on Earth is currently taxing its own people for the privilege of not freezing to death in the winter. The Canadian freeze. If Australia is the world's gas station, then Canada is its strategic reserve. It holds the third largest oil reserves on the entire planet. It is a titan of natural gas, hydroelectric power, and uranium. In a rational world, Canada should be the industrial forge of North America. It should be a place where cheap power and vast resources create an unassailable middle-class paradise. But in 2025, Canada has become something else entirely. It has become a cautionary tale. It is a country that has decided that its greatest strength, its natural resources, is actually its greatest moral failing. Under the banner of climate leadership, Canada has entered a phase of economic contraction that is as baffling as it is destructive. The suicide pact here doesn't just involve shutting down factories. It involves a direct, aggressive tax on the very breath of its citizens. We are talking, of course, about the carbon tax. But to understand the true depth of the Canadian crisis, we have to look past the tax itself and at the ideology behind it. It is the belief that a country representing less than 1.5% of global emissions should bankrupt its own people to set an example, an example that the rest of the world, namely China and India, is openly ignoring. By April 2025, the Canadian carbon tax reached a psychological and economic breaking point. The government's pitch was simple, almost insulting. They said, "We will tax your fuel, your heating, and your transport. But don't worry, we'll send you a rebate check that makes you even richer." It was a promise of free money that defied the basic laws of mathematics, as the Parliamentary Budget Officer's own reports eventually admitted. Once you factor in the fiscal and economic impacts, the lost jobs, the suppressed wages, and the skyrocketing cost of every single physical good that travels by truck, the majority of Canadian households are net losers. But it's worse than just a math error. In Canada, energy isn't a luxury, it is a life support system. When it is minus 30 degrees Celsius in Edmonton or Winnipeg, heating your home isn't a choice you make based on a price signal. It is a biological necessity. By taxing home heating oil and natural gas, the government isn't nudging people to change their behavior. It is simply fining them for the crime of living in a cold climate. One of our Canadian viewers wrote, "My government is taxing me for the air I use to stay alive." That isn't hyperbole. It is the lived reality of millions of people who are watching their disposable income vanish into a bureaucratic black hole. While the tax burns through the pockets of the middle class, the suicide pact is also working at the structural level. Canada has become a place where it is virtually impossible to build anything of scale. Pipelines that would bring Canadian gas to the world market are tied up in decades of litigation and regulatory red tape. While the United States has undergone a shale revolution that made them the world's top energy producer, Canada has sat on its hands, paralyzed by an administrative state that views every new project as a crime against the future. The result? Canada is losing out on hundreds of billions in potential revenue. That is money that could have funded hospitals, schools, and infrastructure. Instead, that capital is fleeing south. Canadian energy companies are taking their billions and investing them in Texas, Guyana, and the Middle East. They are leaving because they know that in Canada, the rules of the game change every time a new ideological fad hits Ottawa. This is how a superpower dies, not by conquest, but by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. We cannot talk about the Canadian Suicide Pact without mentioning the collision between energy policy and the housing crisis. To meet green building codes, the cost of constructing a new home in Canada has exploded. At the same time, the government is pushing for the mass adoption of electric heat pumps. In a temperate climate, a heat pump is an engineering marvel. In a Canadian winter, it is often a useless ornament on the side of a house. When the temperature drops below a certain point, these systems lose their efficiency and switch to backup electric resistance heating. That is the most expensive way to heat a building known to man. This puts an astronomical strain on an electrical grid that is already struggling to keep up with a massive surge in population. The math simply does not work. You cannot bring in 1 million new residents a year. Ban natural gas, mandate electric cars, and expect a grid built in the 1970s to hold the weight. Something has to give. And in Canada, what's giving is the middle class's ability to own a home and keep it warm. What we see in Canada is a loss of national purpose. A country that was built by loggers, miners, and engineers is being redesigned by consultants and activists. The Suicide Pact has convinced the Canadian leadership that their role is not to build a prosperous nation, but to manage a gentle decline. They are telling their citizens to expect less mobility, less warmth, less ownership, all while the country's debt-to-GDP ratio climbs to levels that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. But Canada and Australia are only two parts of this global puzzle. To see the final, most advanced stage of this economic disease, we have to look at the heart of Europe. We have to look at the nation that was supposed to be the green engine of the world, but has instead become the world's biggest warning sign. We are going to Germany. The autopsy continues with the fall of the industrial giant, the collapse of the German giant. If you want to see the terminal phase of the global suicide pact, you have to look at Germany. For decades, Germany was the undisputed heart of European prosperity. It was a manufacturing superpower, a nation built on the engineering perfection of its cars, its chemicals, and its heavy machinery. Made in Germany was more than just a label. It was a guarantee of industrial dominance. But as of 2025, that guarantee has been shredded. Germany has become the sick man of Europe once again, not because of a medical virus, but because of an ideological one. The German economic miracle was built on a very simple foundation: cheap energy from Russia and high-value exports to China. It was a trade-off that worked perfectly, until it didn't. When the pipelines were severed, Germany didn't just lose a supplier, it lost its competitive soul. And instead of pivoting toward a rational, physics-based energy policy, the German leadership doubled down on a plan called Energiewende, the most expensive and disastrous energy transition in human history. The statistics coming out of Germany today are nothing short of a horror story for any economist. In 2024, the German economy lost close to 200,000 companies. That is the highest figure since the 2011 financial crisis. These aren't just mom-and-pop shops closing down. We are seeing the dismantling of the heavy hitters. In 2025, corporate insolvencies in Germany hit a 10-year high in the first half of the year alone. the chemical industry, the glass makers, the steel producers, they are all facing a price tsunami as their long-term energy contracts expire and they are forced into a market where electricity prices are consistently 30 to 40% higher than the European average and 3 to 4 times higher than in the United States or China. Consider the case of the Volkswagen Group, Europe's largest automaker. In 2025, news broke that Volkswagen was closing German factories and laying off tens of thousands of workers. This was a signal flare sent up from the very center of the German economy. If the people who build the world's most famous cars can't afford to build them in Germany, then no one can. The master resource has become so expensive that the act of building things has become a net loss activity. But here is the truly dark part of the German suicide pact. As Germany shuttered its last remaining nuclear plants, a decision that remains a masterclass in political insanity, it didn't actually become green in early 2025 when the wind didn't blow and the sun didn't shine. Germany's energy sector saw an emissions increase of 7%. Why? Because to keep the lights on, they were forced to burn lignite, the dirtiest, most carbon-intensive form of coal. They blew up their clean nuclear plants and replaced them with brown coal and imported gas. It is a system that manages to be both more expensive and more polluting at the same time. The experts in Berlin call this a temporary adjustment, but the market knows better. German companies aren't adjusting, they are fleeing. They are moving their production lines to South Carolina, to Texas, to Poland, and to China. They are taking a century of engineering know-how and thousands of high-paying jobs and simply walking away. This is called deindustrialization. It is the process by which a developed nation reverts to a service-based economy, presiding over a shrinking middle class and a decaying infrastructure. One report from 2025 found that two-thirds of German small and medium enterprises, the Mittelstand that is the backbone of the country, are currently struggling with energy costs. For 13% of them, the burden is already existential. They are one bad quarter away from closing their doors forever. These are the businesses that have been in families for 3 or 4 generations. They survived world wars. They survived the Cold War. But they cannot survive a government that has decided that net zero is more important than net prosperity. As the industrial lights go out across the Ruhr Valley, the question we have to ask is, who benefits? Because wealth doesn't just vanish into thin air, it is transferred. When a German chemical plant closes, a plant in China or the US picks up the slack. When a Canadian homeowner pays a carbon tax, that money flows into a massive bureaucratic machine. The Suicide Pact is a global reshuffling of power, and we are just the ones being moved off the board. But to understand the true scale of this reshuffling, we have to look at the global stage. We have to look at the flow of energy and the flow of power. Because while the West is busy signing its own economic death warrant, the rest of the world is preparing to take the lead. the great energy transfer. While the West is busy performing a slow-motion economic surgery on itself, the rest of the world is not sitting idly by. They are watching, and they are waiting. You see, wealth doesn't just evaporate into the ether. It isn't deleted from the global ledger. It is transferred. In the world of economics, there is a concept known as arbitrage. It is the practice of taking advantage of a price difference between two or more markets. And what we are witnessing today is the greatest energy arbitrage in human history. We are watching the industrial crown of the West being handed over, not by force, but by choice, to the nations of the East. Consider the relationship between Europe and the BRICS nations, particularly Russia and China. When Germany, the UK, and France decided to cut themselves off from cheap, reliable energy pipelines, they didn't stop needing that energy. They just changed the middleman. In 2024 and 2025, we saw a bizarre, almost comedic reality where Russian oil and gas were still flowing into Europe, but only after being laundered through India, Turkey, or Greece. The energy was the same, the molecules were the same, but the price was 30% higher. This is the suicide tax. The West pays a premium to pretend it's being virtuous, while the nations of the East take the difference and invest it into their own military and industrial complexes. But the real winner of the suicide pact isn't the energy seller, it's the industrial competitor. We have to look at China. While the Western media focuses on China's solar panel production, they conveniently ignore what powers the factories that make those panels. It's coal, millions of tons of it. In 2025, China's coal consumption hit yet another record high. They are building a dual energy system. They are building enough renewables to satisfy the global PR machine, but they are backing it all up with a massive, unshakable foundation of fossil fuels and nuclear power. They are playing a game of total energy dominance, while the West is playing a game of carbon accounting. When a chemical plant in Ludwigshafen, Germany, closes its doors because it can no longer afford the electricity, that market share doesn't just disappear. Within months, a state-subsidized plant in a Chinese special economic zone, powered by cheap coal and Russian gas, ramps up its production. The product is the same. The carbon emitted is often higher because Chinese environmental standards are lower, but the price is lower. The West has effectively created a system where we tax our own efficiency and subsidize the inefficiency of our competitors. It is a strategic failure of such magnitude that it almost defies explanation. This is the industrial migration. It is the physical movement of the means of production from high-cost, high-regulation environments to low-cost, high-energy environments. And once a factory moves, it doesn't come back. The skills, the supply chains, the institutional knowledge of how to build a world-class engine or a complex polymer, those things are hard to build and easy to lose. By the time the West realizes the suicide pact was a mistake. The people who knew how to run the machines will be retired, and the machines themselves will be in Shanghai or Mumbai. But why is this happening now? Why has this ideology taken such a firm grip on the leaders of the Anglosphere and Europe? To find the answer, we have to look at the financialization of the Western economy. For the last 30 years, we have been told that we don't need to build things anymore. We were told that we were moving into a service economy, a knowledge economy. We were told that we could live off financial innovation, real estate appreciation, and tech disruptions. We forgot that you cannot eat an app. You cannot keep a house warm with a derivative. You cannot build a bridge with social capital. Every single service, every single digital product, and every single financial transaction sits on top of a physical reality. That reality is energy. By devaluing the physical economy and overvaluing the paper economy, we have made ourselves vulnerable. We have allowed our leaders to believe that energy is just another line item on a spreadsheet, something that can be offset with a carbon credit. The nations of the East do not make this mistake. They understand that power, both electrical and political, comes from the ability to command the physical world. As we move into the final years of this decade, the gap between the energy-rich and the energy-poor will define the new global hierarchy. It won't be about who has the most F-35s or who has the highest GDP on paper. It will be about who can keep their lights on for the lowest cost. It will be about who can feed their people without a government subsidy. The suicide pact is effectively a voluntary surrender of the top spot in that hierarchy. One of our viewers from Singapore noted, "From the outside, it looks like the West is bored with its own success. You are tearing down the very things that made you great, because you've forgotten how hard they were to build." That is the most concise summary of the last 20 years I have ever heard. We are tearing down our cathedrals of industry to build monuments to our own virtue, and the rest of the world is more than happy to haul away the scrap metal. We are going to look at the final objective. Why is this happening to the middle class specifically? And what is the end state of a society that has decided to stop producing? The end of ownership. There is an old saying in engineering, if you want to know how a machine works, don't look at the marketing brochure, look at the output. If we apply that same logic to the current state of the Western economy, the output is becoming very clear. We are moving toward a society where the average person owns nothing, controls nothing, and is entirely dependent on a centralized grid for their survival. The Global Suicide Pact isn't just an environmental policy, it is the ultimate tool for a new kind of economic enclosure. By making energy and resources prohibitively expensive, the ruling class is effectively pricing the middle class out of their own lives. Think about what it takes to be truly independent. You need a home that you own, You need a vehicle that allows you to move freely without a digital permission slip. And you need the ability to heat that home and run that vehicle at a price that doesn't consume your entire paycheck. This is the triple threat to the modern establishment, and every single pillar of the current energy transition is designed to knock those legs out from under you. Let's start with the home. In places like Canada and the United Kingdom, we are seeing the rise of rentier capitalism as the cost of building a house skyrockets due to green mandates and expensive materials, and as the cost of maintaining that house rises due to carbon taxes and electric heating, the dream of ownership is slipping away. We are being nudged, and in some cases pushed, into a world of managed living, high-density, state-sanctioned apartments where your energy usage is monitored by a smart meter that can be throttled during peak demand. Increasingly, it is the stated goal of urban planners, from London to Melbourne. They call it the 15-minute city. You can call it a managed decline. Then, look at the war on the private vehicle. For 100 years, the car was the ultimate symbol of Western freedom. It allowed you to work where you wanted and live where you wanted. But the Suicide Pact has decided that the internal combustion engine must go. They aren't replacing it with a better, cheaper alternative. They are replacing it with a more expensive, less capable technology that depends entirely on a fragile electrical grid. By mandating electric vehicles while simultaneously destroying the baseload power needed to charge them, the government is creating a bottleneck. The result won't be a world where everyone has a Tesla. It will be a world where the majority of the population relies on public transit and ride-sharing apps. You won't own the car. You will rent the trip. This is the subscription model of human existence. When you don't own your energy source, like a wood stove or a gas tank, and you don't own your transport, and you don't own your home, you are no longer a citizen. You are a tenant. You are a serf in a digital feudal system, and the master resource is the chain that holds it all together. By controlling the flow and the price of energy, the elite can control every aspect of your behavior. They can nudge you to eat less meat by making the energy to produce it too expensive. They can nudge you to stay home by making the cost of a road trip equivalent to a week's wages. We see the frustration in our comments every single day. People realize that the math doesn't add up. They see the billionaires flying to climate conferences in private jets to tell us that we shouldn't have air conditioning. They see the big banks and investment firms like BlackRock buying up entire neighborhoods of single-family homes while preaching about sustainability. It's the ultimate do as I say, not as I do. The people pushing the Suicide Pact have no intention of lowering their standard of living. They are simply pulling the ladder up behind them. But there is a deeper, more psychological layer to this. When a society stops producing and starts merely consuming services, it loses its edge. It loses its agency. We are becoming a civilization of users rather than builders. In the nations of the BRICS, those countries that are still building dams, still mining coal, and still forging steel, there is a sense of momentum. There is a belief in the future. In the West, our future is presented as a series of sacrifices we must make to atone for the success of our ancestors. It is a cult of guilt that serves as a cover for a massive wealth grab. One of our viewers, a former industrial engineer from Germany, said it best. We used to dream of nuclear-powered cities and flying cars. Now, we are told that success is a heat pump that works half the time and a smart meter that tells us when we've had enough. This is the managed decline in action. It is the slow, deliberate cooling of the Western engine. And if we don't recognize the design behind it, we are going to find ourselves living in a very cold, very quiet future. In short, we are going to look at the breaking point. Every suicide pact has a moment where the participants realize the cost is too high. We are seeing the first signs of a peasant revolt in the polls and in the streets. From the Dutch farmers to the Canadian truckers, the real economy is starting to push back. The breaking point and the peasant revolt. Every suicide pact eventually hits a wall of cold, hard reality. There is a moment when the ideological fever breaks because the body can no longer sustain the damage. In the West, we are reaching that moment right now. The people who actually keep the world running, the farmers, the truckers, the factory workers, and the small business owners, are beginning to wake up to the fact that they are being sacrificed for a greater good that they never voted for and will never benefit from. This is the start of what history might call the Great Energy Revolt. It started in the Netherlands in 2023 and 2024. We saw Dutch farmers taking to the streets with their tractors, blocking highways and distribution centers. Why? Because the government, in its infinite wisdom, decided that nitrogen emissions from family farms were a bigger threat to the future than the collapse of the food supply. They tried to buy out thousands of farms, essentially liquidating a centuries-old industry to meet an arbitrary bureaucratic target. But the farmers realized something the politicians didn't. You can't eat a carbon credit. This spirit of resistance quickly spread. In Germany, we saw tens of thousands of citizens protesting in Berlin against the heating law that threatened to bankrupt homeowners by forcing them to install expensive heat pumps. In Canada, the Freedom Convoy was about more than just mandates. It was a scream from the physical economy against a digital elite that had completely lost touch with how goods are moved and how lives are lived. The common thread in all these movements is the rejection of the managed decline. People are tired of being told that progress means having less, doing less, and being less. But the most significant pushback isn't happening in the streets, it's happening at the ballot box. We are seeing a political realignment across the Western world. The old labels of left and right are becoming irrelevant. The new divide is between the globalists, who view energy as a tool for social engineering, and the productivists, who view energy as a tool for human flourishing. From the rise of populist movements in Europe to the massive shifts in the Australian and Canadian polls. The message is clear. The public is no longer buying the marketing brochure for the suicide pact. The elites are terrified of this. They respond by calling these movements misinformation or threats to democracy. But what is more threatening to democracy than a government that makes it impossible for its citizens to afford heat? What is more misinformation than telling people that their standard of living is unsustainable while the ruling class lives in luxury? The gaslighting is losing its power because the physical reality of the bill on the kitchen table is a much more powerful teacher than a news anchor on a screen. However, the establishment isn't going to give up easily. As the pushback grows, the suicide pact is shifting gears. We are seeing the introduction of digital IDs and central bank digital currencies, tools that could be used to directly tie your spending and your mobility to your carbon footprint. If they can't convince you to stop using energy through the price, they will try to stop you through programmable money. This is the end game of the energy transition. It is the movement from market prices to resource rationing. But here is the silver lining. The laws of physics are on the side of the people. You can manipulate the news. You can manipulate the currency. But you cannot manipulate the second law of thermodynamics. A society that stops producing more energy than it consumes will eventually collapse under its own weight. The managed decline cannot be managed forever. Eventually, the lights go flickering out. And when that happens, the authority of the bureaucrats flickers out with them. The question for us, the people watching this autopsy, is what we do in the meantime. How do we protect our families? How do we preserve our wealth in a system that is designed to devalue everything we own? In the nations of the BRICS, they aren't waiting for the West to wake up. They are building their own parallel systems, their own energy grids, and their own currencies. They are moving on. And if we want to survive the global suicide pact, we need to start thinking like the winners of the next era, rather than the victims of the current one. One of our viewers from the American Midwest said they want us to live in a world of shadows, but the sun still rises every day, and the coal is still in the ground. Reality hasn't changed. Only the stories they tell us about it. That is the key to survive. You must stop believing the story and start looking at the ground beneath your feet. The autopsy of the narrative. If you want to understand how a population is convinced to sign its own economic death warrant, you have to look at the language being used. The global suicide pact relies on a very specific set of linguistic tricks designed to hide the laws of physics. They use words like transition, renewable, and sustainable. These words are designed to make you feel like we are simply moving from one equivalent power source to another, like switching from one brand of battery to a better one. But in the world of science, and in the world of your bank account, there is no such thing as an equal transition. The fundamental lie of the last 20 years is the idea that energy density doesn't matter. For the entirety of human history. Progress has been defined by moving from low-density energy to high-density energy. We moved from burning wood to burning coal, from coal to oil, from oil to nuclear. Each step allowed us to do more work with less effort. It allowed us to build cities, cure diseases, and fly across oceans. It was an upward ladder of efficiency. It was a journey from the limits of the natural world to the limitless potential of human engineering. The Suicide Pact is the first time in history that a civilization has been told to move down the ladder. We are being told to move from high-density, reliable energy like gas and nuclear back to low-density, intermittent energy like wind and solar. What's emerging is an energy regression because the energy density of a wind farm is thousands of times lower than that of a nuclear power plant. You need thousands of times more land, more copper, more steel, and more maintenance to produce the same amount of work. This is why your bills are going up. It isn't corporate greed. It is the physical cost of inefficiency. It is the cost of trying to fight the second law of thermodynamics with a marketing budget. There is a metric that the experts never talk about on the evening news. It is called EROEI, or Energy Return on Energy Invested. It is the simple calculation of how much energy you have to spend to get a certain amount of energy back. To build a modern civilization, you need an EROEI of at least 12 to 1. Coal and oil gave us returns of 30 to 1, or even 50 to 1. That surplus energy is what paid for our schools, our hospitals, and our vacations. That surplus is the reason you have a weekend. It is the reason you don't have to spend 12 hours a day in a field just to avoid starvation. When you move to a system with an EROEI of 5 to 1 or 3 to 1, like many green projects, you no longer have a surplus. The society stops growing. It becomes cannibalistic. It has to start eating its own capital just to keep the lights on. This is why your infrastructure is crumbling. This is why your healthcare systems are failing and your roads are full of potholes. The surplus energy that used to fund the Western world is being vaporized by the sheer inefficiency of the new system. We are literally burning our future to power a system that cannot sustain itself. The second great lie is the idea of the battery. We are told that it doesn't matter if the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, because we will just store the energy in massive batteries. This is an insult to anyone who can do basic math. To store just 3 days of backup power for a country like Germany or the United Kingdom would require a battery array so massive and so expensive that it would bankrupt the entire planet's supply of lithium and cobalt. It is a physical impossibility. It is a fairy tale told to adults. Yet, it is the foundation of the policy. It is the pillar upon which the entire industrial future of the West is supposedly resting. So why do they keep lying? Because the lie creates scarcity, and scarcity creates control. If energy is cheap and abundant, the government has very little power over you. You can go where you want, build what you want, and live how you want. But if energy is scarce, if it has to be managed and rationed and allocated by a central authority, then you are under their thumb. You are no longer a customer. You are a ward of the state. The narrative isn't about the environment. It is about moving from a market economy to a command economy. It is about the centralization of power through the control of the master resource. Look at the nations of the BRICS again. They aren't falling for the narrative. They aren't banning the master resource. They are building a world based on energy realism. They are using the cheap coal and gas that we are virtuously leaving in the ground to build the factories that will sell us the very solar panels we think will save us. It is the ultimate irony of the 21st century. We are de-industrializing ourselves to buy green tech from the most coal-dependent economies on Earth. We are exporting our pollution and our prosperity and importing a sense of moral superiority that you can't use to heat your home. One of our viewers, a former power grid operator, left a comment that stayed with me. He said, "The grid doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about your targets or your political promises. It only cares about frequency and load. If you lie to the grid will eventually tell you the truth with a blackout." That is the moment we are approaching. The narrative is about to hit the reality of the load. The gap between what we are told and what we are experiencing is becoming a canyon. And in that canyon, the middle class is being lost. As the physical reality of the energy crisis becomes impossible to ignore, we have to move toward a strategy of survival. We have to look at how to protect ourselves from a system that has decided we are the problem. We have to look at the wealth of nations versus the wealth of the individual in the age of the Great Collapse. We have to find the exit strategy, and the new global reality. We have performed the autopsy. We have looked at the hollowed-out grids of the United Kingdom, the resource betrayal in Australia, the tax-funded freeze in Canada, and the industrial ghost towns of Germany. The evidence is undeniable. The Global Suicide Pact is not a series of unfortunate mistakes or well-intentioned errors. It is a fundamental redesign of the Western world. It is the transition from a society of growth and ownership to a society of managed decline and total dependency. But understanding the crime is only the first step. The real question, the only question that matters for you and your family, is what you do now. How do you survive a suicide pact that you never signed? The first thing you must do is realize that the cavalry is not coming. The political class, the experts in the media, and the bureaucrats in the international organizations, they are the ones who wrote the pact. They are the architects of the decline. They are not going to save you from it because their continued status depends on the pact being carried out to its conclusion. To survive, you have to stop looking for a political solution and start looking for a personal one. You have to move from a state-dependent mindset to a self-sustaining mindset. You have to become an island of competence in a sea of a managed failure. This starts with the master resource. To the extent that you are able, you must de-risk your life from the centralized energy grid. In a world where energy is being used as a tool for social engineering and behavioral control, independence is the ultimate luxury. It is the ultimate act of rebellion. Whether it's investing in off-grid capability, securing physical access to fuel, or simply moving your capital into assets that aren't tied to the paper economy. You need to create a buffer. You need to be the person who can keep the lights on and the house warm even when the smart meter says you've had enough. You cannot wait for the system to become rational again. You have to create your own rationality. Secondly, you have to recognize the shift in the global hierarchy. The nations of the BRICS and the emerging economies of the global South are not following the West off the cliff. They are not interested in a suicide pact. They are building the future on the very foundations we are tearing down. This means the flow of wealth is changing direction. For a century, the safest place for your money was in Western institutions. But as those institutions prioritize sustainability targets over actual productivity, that is no longer a certainty. Diversification isn't just a financial strategy anymore. It's a survival strategy. You need to be aware of where the real economy is moving and make sure you aren't left holding a bag of worthless carbon credits when the music finally stops. But perhaps the most important part of the exit strategy is psychological. You have to reject the cult of guilt. You have to stop believing the lie that your prosperity is a sin that needs to be atoned for. Human flourishing is not a crime. Wanting a warm home, a reliable car, and a better life for your children than the one you had is not unsustainable. It is the most natural and noble human impulse.